What happens when a beloved Hollywood star steps onto a talk show, ready to engage in a light-hearted conversation, but instead finds themselves at the center of a heated clash? This was the reality when actor Michael J. Fox appeared on a popular daytime talk show, only for the conversation to take an unexpected and fiery turn. What started as a warm welcome from the hosts quickly escalated into a confrontation that would leave viewers and the studio audience stunned. The tension was palpable as Michael J. Fox, the celebrated star of Back to the Future and a longtime advocate for Parkinson's research, took his seat. The applause from the studio audience was thunderous, echoing the reverence the public had for him. The hosts greeted him warmly, especially Whoopi Goldberg, who seemed genuinely excited to have him on the show. But as the conversation progressed, it became clear that not everyone was on the same page. For the first few minutes, everything was as expected. Michael spoke about his new memoir, detailing his journey with Parkinson's disease and the incredible work his foundation was doing to help fund research. His humor, charm, and grace in the face of adversity had the audience laughing and applauding. But when one of the co-hosts, Behar, steered the conversation in a more controversial direction, the dynamic shifted. What seemed like a friendly chat about activism and celebrity quickly turned into a tense exchange. "Michael," Joy began, leaning forward slightly, "you've been very public about your condition, and your advocacy work is admirable, but don't you think that sometimes celebrity activism can feel a bit out of touch? You've got resources that most people with Parkinson's could only dream of. Do you really understand what it's like for people who don't have that kind of privilege?" The studio fell into a sudden silence, and Michael's expression remained calm, but his eyes flickered for a moment, betraying the hint of discomfort. After a brief pause, he responded, his voice steady. "That's an interesting way to frame it, Joy. Yes, I'm fortunate to have resources, but that's exactly why I use my platform. I can open doors for others, fund research, and advocate for those who don't have a voice. Isn't that what privilege is for?" Joy wasn't done yet, though. "Sure, but Michael," she continued, "when you talk about healthcare reform or raising funds for research, you're not exactly experiencing what people in real need are going through. You don't sit in crowded clinics waiting for hours because you can't afford the treatment, and you're not rationing medication because insurance won't cover it. How can you really represent the reality of those who are struggling?" The air grew heavy. Michael, still maintaining his composure, raised a hand gently, signaling his desire to respond. "Joy, I think you're confusing having resources with being disconnected," he said, his tone slightly sharper now. "I speak to people with Parkinson's every day. I hear their struggles. The foundation I run doesn't just fund research. We help families get access to the care they need. We fight insurance companies, push for policy changes, things that impact everyone, not just the privileged." Joy wasn't backing down. "But Michael," she pressed, "you still have a comfort that the average person doesn't. You're not facing the same challenges, like waiting for a doctor's appointment or worrying if you'll make it to the next day. You can afford the best treatments. How do you justify advocating for those who are struggling when your experience is so different?" The conversation was no longer just about Parkinson's or activism. It had become deeply personal, and the audience could feel the heat building. Michael J. Fox paused for a moment, his hands steady on the armrests of his chair. He took a deep breath before responding, his voice more forceful now. "Joy, I'm not disconnected from the struggles of others. I live with the same condition every day. My journey is shaped by the same fears, frustrations, and limitations that anyone with Parkinson's faces. Yes, I may have the privilege of having access to better doctors, but that doesn't make my experience any less real. I have the same uncertainty about my future, the same fight to keep going despite the limitations of this disease," he explained, his words filled with quiet intensity. Joy's expression didn't soften. "But Michael," she said, leaning in closer, "you've made your career advocating for causes, and that's great. But at the end of the day, you can afford the best treatments, while others are still struggling just to survive. And you're right, your experience is real, but so is the gap between you and the people you're advocating for. You've got access to resources that others can only dream of, and it's easy to push for change when you're not directly impacted by the lack of access." The tension in the room was palpable. The studio audience, which had been applauding Michael's every word just moments before, seemed unsure of how to react now. Some seemed to agree with Joy, while others were clearly on Michael's side. Michael's voice rose slightly, his frustration evident. "I get it, Joy. You're concerned about the difference between my life and someone else's, but here's the truth. This disease doesn't care about wealth, privilege, or fame. Parkinson's affects people from all walks of life, regardless of their bank accounts. And just because I have more resources doesn't mean I should stay quiet or not use my platform. If anything, it means I have a responsibility to speak up for those who don't have the same access." Joy wasn't ready to let go. "But Michael," she pressed, "how can you really speak for those who don't have the same privileges? You don't know what it's like to struggle with the day-to-day grind of trying to get by. You're not stuck in a broken healthcare system. You've got the best doctors, the best treatments. How can you relate to those who don't have that luxury?" The audience shifted uneasily. Michael had reached the edge of his patience. "You want me to apologize for having access to the best care? You want me to stop advocating because my life isn't as hard as someone else's? That's not how advocacy works, Joy. It's about using whatever platform you have to make a difference. Just because I have the means to fight doesn't mean I shouldn't fight for everyone." At this point, the other hosts began to realize the conversation was getting out of hand. Whoopi Goldberg, who had remained quiet up until now, leaned forward, attempting to steer the conversation back on track. Okay. Let's all take a moment," she said, trying to diffuse the rising tension. "Michael, I understand your point, but Joy has a point too. This is getting a bit personal. Let's step back and rethink the tone of the discussion, all right?" Michael, visibly irritated, shook his head. "You're telling me to step back? Why should I? You're the one who asked me questions that are designed to make me look bad, and now, when I defend myself, I'm the one who's out of line. No, Joy started this by questioning my motives. I'm just not going to apologize for wanting to make a difference." Joy wasn't finished. "I'm not questioning your motives, Michael. I'm just saying, your experience, as valuable as it is fundamentally different from those you're trying to represent. You can't deny that." Michael's hands gripped the armrests again. His frustration was clear, but there was a calmness in his voice that held a powerful edge. "I've spent over 2 decades building a foundation, raising money, and fighting for better healthcare access. I've used my platform to amplify the voices of those who don't have the luxury of a big audience. You think that's easy? That's not some hobby or performance for me, Joy. That's my life's work. And for you to dismiss it like that, it's insulting." Joy rolled her eyes, brushing aside his words. "It's not about insulting you, Michael. It's about acknowledging that there's a huge gap between your experience and the reality for most people. You can't pretend that your activism, no matter how well-intentioned, speaks for everyone." Michael's face flushed, his patience wearing thin. "You know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe I do have a different experience, but that doesn't make my advocacy any less important. And if you can't see that, then we have a bigger problem here." The studio was in total silence now. Even Whoopi, normally the voice of reason, seemed unsure of how to continue. The argument had escalated so quickly that no one was quite sure how to put the brakes on it. And as the camera lingered on the tense silence, it became clear that this wasn't going to end without someone getting hurt, emotionally, if nothing else. As the conversation simmered, Michael J. Fox's frustration began to boil over. The tension in the studio was becoming unbearable, and despite Whoopi's best attempts to calm things down, the confrontation continued to escalate. The audience, which had been on the edge of their seats from the start, now found themselves in a tense standoff, unsure which direction the conversation would go. "I'm not going to apologize for having a platform," Michael said, his voice quiet but filled with intensity. "I'm not going to apologize for having resources, and I'm certainly not going to apologize for using them to help people. You think it's easy to advocate for a cause when you're constantly fighting against a system that doesn't care? You think it's easy to wake up every day wondering how much of my life I'm going to have left to fight for this cause? My experience with Parkinson's isn't any less real just because I have the means to fight it." Joy, still not satisfied, shot back with her usual biting tone. "It's not about your resources, Michael. It's about your understanding of the people you claim to represent. You're talking about research funding and healthcare reform like they're abstract concepts. You're not sitting in the trenches with those who are affected every day. You've never had to make impossible choices between paying for medication and paying your rent. So how can you possibly speak for them? The words hung in the air, and the audience fell into a heavy silence. Michael's jaw tightened as he stared at Joy. He had been calm up to this point, but now there was an undeniable edge to his voice. "So, what do you suggest I do, Joy? Do you think I should just walk away from everything I've built? Should I stop funding research because it's not my reality? Should I just shut up and let others fight for change while I sit in my comfortable life?" Joy's expression hardened. "No, Michael. I'm not saying you should stop, but you need to understand that your activism is coming from a place of privilege. You don't live the struggles that most people with Parkinson's do. Your world is different from theirs, and that's where your message becomes skewed. You're speaking from a position of power, and that's something most people simply can't relate to." The studio was now a battlefield. It was no longer just about Parkinson's or health care. This was about class, privilege, and the divide between those who had resources and those who didn't. The tension was so thick that you could cut it with a knife. Michael leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Joy. "You're missing the point," he said. "You're treating my advocacy like it's a performance, like I'm just a rich guy trying to make myself look good. But I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for every person with Parkinson's who doesn't have the luxury of getting a seat at the table, for the people who can't afford treatment, who don't have access to the resources I do. That's who I'm fighting for." Joy crossed her arms, clearly unconvinced. "But Michael, you can't ignore the fact that your experience is vastly different from theirs. And when you talk about change, it's not as immediate for people who are just trying to get by. You've got the luxury of hope, but for them, it feels like a distant dream." The clash between them was no longer about facts or experiences. It was about perspectives, and neither side seemed willing to yield. Whoopi, sensing the conversation was spiraling out of control, stepped in again. "Okay, folks, we need to take a breath," she said, her tone more authoritative now. "This is getting out of hand. Let's all calm down, and maybe we can have a real conversation about the issues here without getting personal." But Michael wasn't having it. "No, Whoopi, this is exactly why we're where we are," he said, standing up. "You want to talk about real change? Real progress? Then we need to stop pretending that activism only counts if you're struggling. We need to stop acting like the only people who deserve to speak up are the ones who've suffered the most. That's not how change happens." As he spoke, the room seemed to grow colder. Joy's face reddened and she shot back, "So now you're the expert on how change happens, huh? Because you've got money and fame? You think your experiences make you more qualified than everyone else?" Michael took a deep breath, his voice steady but rising with emotion. "No, I'm not saying I'm more qualified. But I'm saying I have the ability to help, and that's why I'm using my platform. I'm not apologizing for my privilege. I'm using it to fight for people who can't fight for themselves." The hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to intervene. This wasn't just a difference of opinion anymore. This was a breakdown in communication, a clash of ideologies that was playing out on live television. The silence that followed Michael's words was thick, almost suffocating. It was as if the entire studio had collectively held its breath, waiting for someone to speak up, to diffuse the situation. But no one did. Joy's gaze was unwavering, and Michael stood his ground, his eyes never leaving hers. Finally, Joy broke the silence, her voice sharp with frustration. "You're missing the point, Michael. It's not about you helping people. It's about how you choose to help. You're not seeing the bigger picture. You're not seeing how your advocacy might feel to the people who don't have the luxury of affording treatments or getting into research studies. You're speaking for them, but you're not living their lives." Michael's fists clenched at his sides, the anger now boiling beneath his calm exterior. "And I'm supposed to apologize for that?" he asked, his voice rising. "I've dedicated my life to this cause. I've spent decades raising awareness, pushing for changes that will impact everyone, not just those who can afford the best care. I'm not sitting on my hands, Joy. I'm fighting. And you're telling me I should stop because my life is different? Joy shook her head, her expression almost pitying. I'm not telling you to stop, Michael. I'm telling you to stop pretending like your experience is the same as someone who's barely scraping by. You don't have to worry about whether you can afford treatment or whether your insurance will cover the cost of your medications. You don't know what it's like to be stuck in the system with no way out. Michael exhaled sharply, his frustration bubbling over. You don't get it, Joy. You don't get that I'm fighting for people who are just like me. People who have Parkinson's, who are struggling, who don't have the luxury of speaking out because the system is set up to keep them down. I may have resources, but that doesn't mean I'm not in this fight with them. I'm not pretending to be a martyr, but I'm also not going to sit here and let you tell me that my work doesn't matter just because I have more access. The air in the studio was electric. The audience, once captivated by the light-hearted banter, was now divided, watching in stunned silence. The conversation had taken a sharp turn, and it was clear that no one, least of all Michael and Joy, was going to back down. Joy leaned in closer, her voice cutting through the tension. You're right about one thing, Michael. Your work does matter, but you can't pretend that it's not coming from a place of comfort. You can't claim to be the voice for those who are suffering if you don't acknowledge that your experience is vastly different. You've got a cushion to fall back on, and not everyone has that luxury. Michael's eyes narrowed, his voice now cold and controlled. You know what, Joy? You keep coming back to the same argument, but you're missing the real point. This isn't about me, or my resources, or my comfort. It's about the people who need help. It's about using whatever I have to make sure that the fight for better health care is heard. And if you think my privilege makes my advocacy any less valid, then maybe we're not on the same page at all. At this, the room went quiet again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The other hosts, clearly uncomfortable, exchanged glances. Whoopi, who had been silent for a while, finally stood up, trying to regain control of the situation. Okay, let's all just take a deep breath here, she said, her voice firm but calm. This has gone too far. We're not here to attack anyone. We're here to have a conversation. But Michael wasn't listening anymore. His frustration had reached its breaking point, and the need to defend his life's work was now outweighing everything else. No, Whoopi, this isn't just a conversation, he said, his voice edged with emotion. This is an attack. You invited me here to talk about my book, to talk about my foundation, to talk about the progress we've made. But instead, I've had to defend myself against accusations that I don't care about the people I'm fighting for. And that's not just unfair, it's wrong. Joy, not one to back down easily, shot back. Well, maybe you should stop pretending like you're the only one who cares about these issues. There are people who are fighting every day for change without all the applause and recognition. They don't have the luxury of having a foundation or being in the spotlight. Michael's eyes flashed, the tension in his voice rising again. You're right, Joy. There are plenty of people who fight without recognition. But that doesn't make their fight any less valid. And just because I'm in the spotlight doesn't mean I should be silenced or accused of being disconnected. I'm using the attention I get to fight for the change that's needed. And if you can't see that, then maybe I've wasted my time here. The tension in the studio was now palpable, the room hanging on every word. The conversation was no longer about the merits of activism or celebrity involvement. It was about personal beliefs, principles, and an ideological clash that neither side seemed willing to back down from. At this point, the conversation had devolved from a polite exchange of differing views to a full-blown standoff. The cameras captured every tense moment, and the once friendly atmosphere had turned into a battle of wills. Michael J. Fox stood firmly in his beliefs, unwilling to let Joy's criticisms go unanswered. He was not just defending his work. He was defending his integrity, his commitment to the cause that had consumed his life for decades. Joy, too, stood her ground. She had pressed Michael, asking him to acknowledge his privilege, questioning the very essence of his activism. But it was clear now that neither party was willing to yield, and the studio audience seemed to sense that they were witnessing something monumental. This wasn't just a celebrity interview, it was a cultural clash. a collision of perspectives that had been building for years. "I've been fighting for people with Parkinson's since the moment I was diagnosed," Michael said, his voice filled with conviction. "You can accuse me of many things, but you can't accuse me of not caring. I've raised over $2 billion for Parkinson's research. I've lobbied Congress for policy changes. I've spent years amplifying the voices of those who don't have the platform I do. And yet, you're sitting here telling me that my activism doesn't count because I have more access than others." The words hit harder than he intended, and the silence that followed felt deafening. Joy's expression hardened, but she didn't back down. "I'm not saying it doesn't count," she replied, her voice sharp. "I'm saying it's not the same. You talk about all the great work you're doing, but you can't ignore the fact that you're doing it from a place of comfort. You're not fighting the same battles as the people you claim to represent. You're not living in the trenches with them." Michael's jaw tightened. "So, let me get this straight. Because I have resources, I'm supposed to stop. I'm supposed to step aside and let people who don't have the means to fight step in. That's your solution? That's what you think will make things better?" Joy leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her face a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "No, Michael. What I'm saying is that you need to understand that your activism, as noble as it may be, is coming from a place of privilege. You've got the best doctors, the best treatments, and the best research. How can you possibly speak for someone who doesn't even know where their next doctor's appointment is coming from?" Michael's voice lowered to a dangerous calm, his words deliberate. "You're right, Joy. My experience is different. But the people I'm fighting for, those who don't have access to the same resources, they're not fighting for a cure in the same way I am. They're fighting just to survive. And that's exactly why I use my platform. That's why I won't stop speaking up. Because if I don't, who will?" The room felt colder now. The audience sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling heavily on everyone present. It wasn't just about Parkinson's disease anymore. It was about the responsibility that comes with privilege, the question of who gets to speak for whom, and the implications of using one's platform to fight for change. Joy, refusing to back down, pressed once more. "You think just because you have resources, you're the only one who can make a difference? You're speaking from your position of comfort, but you're not actually living the struggles that millions of others are facing. How can you represent their reality when your world is so far removed from theirs?" Michael's hands gripped the armrests again, his frustration evident. "I get what you're saying, Joy, but you're missing the bigger picture. It's not about living the same life as someone else. It's about using what you have to help make things better. And that's what I'm doing. I'm not pretending to have all the answers, but I'm using my voice and my platform to help amplify theirs." But Joy wasn't finished. "And what about the rest of us, Michael? What about people who don't have the luxury of being a celebrity? People who are just as passionate about these issues but don't get the attention? It feels like you're overshadowing their work, even if you don't mean to." Michael shook his head slowly. "You're wrong, Joy. I'm not trying to overshadow anyone. But if you're asking me to stay silent because I have privilege, then I'm not going to comply. We all have our roles to play in this fight, but no one gets to dictate who's allowed to speak." The moment of truth had arrived. There was no going back now. The conversation had become personal, and the stakes had been raised. The hosts, now visibly uncomfortable, tried to intervene once again, but it was clear that the damage had been done. Whoopi Goldberg, her voice softer now, looked at both Michael and Joy. "Listen, folks, we're not going to get anywhere like this. The conversation's gone way off course. We need to take a step back, breathe, and think about how we can actually make this productive." But Michael wasn't listening anymore. He had made his point. He had fought for the cause, for the people who needed his help, and now he wasn't going to let anyone undermine his work, especially not on national television. "I'm done here," he said, his voice steady but final. "I came to talk about my book, about the progress we've made, about the people we're helping. But instead, I've been made to defend my entire life's work. So, if this is how it's going to be, I'll take my leave." With that, Michael stood up, his eyes meeting Joy's one last time. The audience, still in shock from the heated exchange, remained silent. Some were applauding, Some were still processing what they had just witnessed, but all were aware that they had just seen something unprecedented. The studio was still as if time itself had paused. Michael J. Fox, his face a mixture of frustration and resolve, walked off the set. The audience, still in shock, couldn't quite figure out whether to applaud or remain in silence. The chaos had unfolded so quickly that even the most seasoned talk show veterans weren't sure how to react. As Michael made his way toward the exit, his words hung in the air like a heavy fog. He had made it clear. His advocacy wasn't about his own comfort or privilege. It was about using the platform he had to fight for those who didn't have the same opportunities. But the backlash from Joy's accusations had hit hard, and there was no turning back now. Whoopi Goldberg, who had been trying to play the role of peacemaker throughout the conversation, was left standing behind her desk, her face etched with disappointment. She had tried to intervene, but it had all happened too fast. The damage was done, and there was no way to smooth over the rift that had just been created. "All right, everyone," she said, finally breaking the silence. "Let's all just take a breath. This is a lot to process." Her voice was calm, but there was a trace of sadness in it. "We're going to go to commercial break. We'll figure out what happens next." The camera cut to the studio's breakaway shot, and the audience seemed to exhale collectively. The energy in the room had shifted, the once light-hearted atmosphere now replaced by a deep sense of unease. The hosts exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to move forward. What had started as a discussion about activism in healthcare had turned into an explosive personal confrontation. No one was prepared for how things had spiraled so quickly. As the break dragged on, the production team scrambled behind the scenes, likely trying to assess the situation and come up with a strategy for what to do next. The tension in the room had reached its peak, and it was unclear whether the show could recover from this monumental moment. Back in the studio, Joy Behar sat in silence, arms folded, her expression hard. She was still visibly shaken by the exchange, though she refused to show any sign of regret. It was clear that, in her mind, she hadn't done anything wrong. She had asked difficult questions, questions that many people were likely wondering themselves. But the way Michael had pushed back had rattled her. "You know, I didn't come here to make a spectacle," Joy finally said, her voice low. "I came here to have a conversation, to ask the tough questions, but somehow it feels like I've been vilified for just doing my job." Whoopi, who had been standing off to the side, now stepped forward. "It's not about vilifying, Joy. It's about respecting the other person's point of view. You ask tough questions, yes, but it's important to remember that sometimes the answers we get are just as tough." Joy nodded, though she didn't seem fully convinced. "I understand that, Whoopi, but this went too far. I didn't expect this level of hostility. It wasn't supposed to be a fight." Meanwhile, the producers worked feverishly behind the scenes, adjusting the show's direction. No one had prepared for this kind of confrontation, and now the entire set felt like it was under a microscope. They were still in the middle of a live broadcast, and they had to quickly decide how to address the elephant in the room when the show returned from commercial. The audience, though mostly silent, had clearly been affected by the argument. They had seen something raw and unfiltered, a behind-the-scenes look at how deeply personal discussions about privilege, activism, and healthcare could quickly turn into a confrontation of egos and emotions. The entire show had taken on an uncomfortable edge, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the cameras rolled again, Whoopi Goldberg appeared on screen, her face reflecting the weight of what had just unfolded. The studio, usually filled with lively chatter, was now eerily quiet, the air thick with unresolved tension. The clash between Michael J. Fox and Joy Behar was far from over, and everyone in the room could feel it. "Welcome back, everyone," Whoopi said, her voice steady but heavy with the lingering emotion of the earlier exchange. "As you just witnessed, this conversation has gotten a bit intense, but sometimes that's what happens when we talk about important issues. Things get personal, and maybe that's not always a bad thing." The camera zoomed in on Whoopi, who glanced briefly at the empty chair where Michael J. Fox had been sitting just minutes earlier. "Now, I know there's a lot to unpack here, and I want to give everyone a chance to calm down. Let's be clear, we're not here to attack anyone. We're here to have difficult conversations about privilege, activism, and what it means to truly fight for change." The silence in the studio remained. The other hosts, who had remained mostly quiet during the altercation, exchanged nervous glances. Sarah Haynes, who had been caught in the crossfire, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She wasn't sure if she wanted to jump in or simply wait for the storm to pass. The camera panned to Joy, who was now visibly upset, her hands tightly gripping the edge of the table. "I didn't ask for this, Whoopi," she muttered under her breath. "I didn't come here to be ambushed. I just asked the questions everyone's thinking." Whoopi nodded, acknowledging Joy's frustration but also recognizing the larger issue. "I get that, Joy, but sometimes we need to ask those tough questions with a little more empathy. And I think that's what's been missing here today. We can't dismiss someone's experience just because it's different from our own." Joy didn't respond immediately. Her lips pressed tight in a thin line. She wasn't convinced. "I don't need empathy for asking the right questions. I need clarity. I need honesty," she snapped, her voice rising again. "It's easy for him to sit there and talk about all the good work he's doing. But the reality is, not everyone has the luxury of a platform to help others." The tension between them was palpable. Whoopi, sensing that the conversation was about to spiral out of control again, turned toward Sarah, hoping for a neutral perspective. "Sarah, what do you think? Where do we go from here?" Sarah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable being thrust into the middle of this battle. "I think," she said carefully, choosing her words, "that both sides have valid points. Michael is right to use his platform to advocate for those who don't have a voice. But I also understand where Joy is coming from. There's a difference between advocacy when you're at the top and when you're just trying to survive." Joy let out a sharp breath, nodding in agreement. "Exactly. That's all I've been saying." Whoopi turned back to the camera, addressing the audience directly. "We've heard from both sides, and I know there are strong feelings about this. But let's remember, the goal is always the same: to fight for change, for better health care, for more equality. The method may differ, but that doesn't mean one is more valid than the other." The conversation had shifted from a personal clash to a broader discussion about activism and privilege. Whoopi, acting as the peacemaker, tried to steer the ship back to calmer waters. But the emotional weight of the argument was still hanging in the air. The show had entered uncharted territory. The audience, who had tuned in expecting another feel-good segment, had instead witnessed an explosive confrontation between two powerful personalities. Some would call it a moment of truth, while others would see it as a shameful display of ego. But either way, the divide between them had never been more apparent. It was clear that this wasn't just about Michael's advocacy work anymore. It was about the deeper question of who had the right to speak for those who were suffering and who could claim to represent their voices. And the more they debated, the further apart their views seemed to grow. The tension in the studio was so thick, it seemed like the audience could cut it with a knife. Whoopi, as the host, tried to keep the peace, but even she seemed unsure of how to proceed. The clash between Michael J. Fox and Joy Behar had become the focal point of the entire show, overshadowing the intended conversation about Michael's memoir and his foundation's work. "I think it's time for a reality check," Joy said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. She was visibly still shaken but determined to have the last word. "We're not here to play nice. We're here to discuss real issues that affect real people. And sometimes that means calling out people, even those we admire, for their blind spots." Michael turned toward her, his face hardening. "Blind spots, huh? Let's talk about blind spots. You're sitting here, accusing me of being disconnected, but you don't know the first thing about what I go through every day. You don't know what it's like to wake up not knowing if you'll be able to button your own shirt, or if your body will betray you in the middle of a public appearance." The audience shifted uncomfortably, torn between the two. Some nodded in agreement with Michael's frustration, while others seemed to still resonate with Joy's point about privilege and access. "I'm not accusing you of being privileged." "Michael," Joy retorted, her voice tight, "I'm accusing you of not understanding that your experience is different, and that doesn't mean you can speak for everyone. People like you don't face the same barriers that others do. People like me, who have to fight tooth and nail for basic care. Michael's gaze locked onto hers, intense and unyielding. "What are you trying to say, Joy? That, because I have money, my fight doesn't matter? That my voice is somehow invalid because I don't live the same life as someone in a different financial situation? If you think that, then you've completely missed the point of activism." Joy stood her ground, leaning forward in her seat. "I'm saying that your experience doesn't give you the right to minimize what others are going through. You talk about your struggles, your fight, your platform. But what about the people who can't afford to fight? The ones who are still waiting for answers, for treatment, for anything?" The confrontation had turned into an all-out verbal battle. The subtle jabs had escalated into open attacks, each side entrenched in their own beliefs, unwilling to budge. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in on both Michael and Joy, each trying to assert their own perspective. Whoopi, who had been silent for the past few moments, finally broke in. "This isn't helping anyone," she said firmly, but with a softness in her tone. "The show isn't about tearing each other down. We came here to talk, not to fight. We have to stop attacking each other personally. Yes, we have differences. Yes, we have strong opinions. But we also have to respect each other." Michael didn't look at Whoopi, his eyes still locked on Joy. "Respect? You want me to respect someone who's questioning the very foundation of what I've dedicated my life to? You want me to sit here and nod along as you tear apart everything I've worked for?" Joy, equally unyielding, shot back. "I'm not tearing anything down. I'm pointing out that privilege isn't the same as lived experience. You can't claim to be the voice of the people when your experience is so far removed from theirs." The back and forth had reached its boiling point, and it was clear that there was no resolution in sight. The conversation had become too personal, too heated. The hosts, unable to find common ground between Michael and Joy, stood in the background, quietly observing the drama unfold. The tension finally broke when Michael, his jaw clenched, turned toward the audience for the first time in the entire conversation. "You know what? I've had enough. I didn't come here to defend myself against accusations. I came to talk about the work we're doing, the progress we're making, and the people we're helping. But all we've done here is tear each other down, and I'm not going to be a part of it anymore." The studio audience, sensing the finality of Michael's words, grew still. The confrontation had taken its toll. Michael was no longer just defending his work. He was now emotionally drained, the weight of the entire situation pressing down on him. With a final glance at Joy, Michael shook his head. "I'm done. If you want to continue questioning everything I've built, go ahead. But I'm not going to sit here and let you discredit everything I've fought for. Goodbye, Joy." With that, Michael stood up, his posture stiff but resolute. He walked off the set, leaving behind the broken remnants of what had once been a hopeful conversation. The studio cameras followed him, capturing every moment as he exited. Some of the audience members were applauding, others still in shock from the intensity of what they had just witnessed. The camera lingered on Michael J. Fox as he made his exit, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the quiet studio. The once lively and celebratory atmosphere had been replaced by a heavy stillness. The conflict, which had started as a debate over privilege and activism, had now shifted into something more personal. It was clear that what had transpired wasn't just a clash of ideas. It was a clash of identities, emotions, and egos. As the doors to the studio closed behind Michael, Whoopi Goldberg was left to try and steer the conversation back to some semblance of normalcy. The other hosts sat in stunned silence, unsure of what to say or how to continue. The audience, equally caught off guard, sat in hushed anticipation, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. Whoopi finally spoke, her voice quieter now, tinged with disappointment. "Well, that was intense." She paused, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for the right words. "I think we all need a moment to process what just happened. This wasn't just a discussion. It was a moment that, frankly, got away from us." Joy Behar sat stiffly, her arms still crossed, her eyes fixed on the table. She didn't seem to regret what had happened, though there was a certain weariness in her demeanor. She had fought hard for her perspective, and though she had lost the battle in the most dramatic of ways, she wasn't ready to back down. I'm just trying to do what's right, Joy said, her voice softer now but still firm. I asked the questions that needed to be asked. Michael's experience, as valuable as it is, isn't the only reality. He's fighting a different fight from the people who don't have access to the resources he does. I'm not attacking him. I'm challenging him to see the bigger picture. Whoopi nodded, understanding the frustration behind Joy's words, but also seeing the deeper conflict beneath them. I get it, Joy, but sometimes the way we ask those questions makes a difference. We can't always come at people with sharp edges. We have to acknowledge that we're all in this together, fighting for the same thing: better health care, better lives, better futures. Sarah Haynes, who had been quiet for most of the discussion, finally spoke up. It's hard to pick sides in a conversation like this. Both Michael and Joy have valid points, and both of them have made important contributions to the conversation. But I think what's clear now is that there's more than one way to fight for change. And we all need to learn how to listen to each other, even when we disagree. Joy, sensing the shift in tone, let out a frustrated sigh. I wasn't trying to diminish his work. I was just trying to make him see that there's a huge difference between fighting from a place of privilege and fighting from a place of survival. I'm not going to apologize for asking hard questions. None of us are apologizing, Joy, Whoopi replied, her tone even but firm. But the way we engage with each other matters. We're all trying to make a difference, but we can't do that if we're constantly at each other's throats. The conversation began to settle into a calmer rhythm, but the damage had already been done. The audience had witnessed a personal attack that had left Michael J. Fox feeling betrayed, even as he left with his head held high. The co-hosts could only watch as the aftermath of the fiery exchange lingered, uncertain of how to recover from the fallout. As the tension slowly began to dissipate, Whoopi Goldberg took a deep breath, her mind still processing the heated exchange that had unfolded. The studio had gone quiet, the audience's mixed reactions lingering in the air. They had all witnessed something profound, an argument between two passionate individuals, each deeply committed to their cause but unable to find common ground. The show had started with the promise of a thoughtful discussion, but it had ended in a personal confrontation that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. Well, that was a lot, Whoopi said finally, turning her attention back to the audience. This wasn't the conversation we planned for today, but maybe it's the conversation we needed. Sometimes when emotions are high, we find out where the real challenges lie. The other hosts nodded in agreement, their faces reflective. No one seemed quite sure how to proceed, but they all knew that the events of the last hour had left a lasting impact. There was no going back to business as usual. The fight for social change, for better health care, for better access, had never felt so personal. Joy sat back in her chair, the earlier fire in her eyes now replaced with something more thoughtful. I didn't expect things to get so heated, she said quietly. But maybe that's the problem. We don't talk about these things enough. We don't talk about the real differences in people's experiences. We don't acknowledge how wide the gap really is between the haves and the have-nots. Whoopi, sensing the shift in tone, leaned forward slightly. We need to talk about it, Joy, but we also need to remember that we're all on the same team. The goal is the same: better access, better care, better lives for everyone. The way we get there may look different for each of us, but that doesn't mean we're not fighting for the same thing. Sarah, still processing everything, added, I think what struck me most was how personal this all became. Michael's work is meaningful, and it's clear that he cares. But Joy is right, too. His experience is different. And when we're talking about something as personal as healthcare, the way we approach it matters. We have to be willing to listen to each other's experiences. Joy nodded, her expression softening. I agree. I just hope that people understand that when I ask tough questions, it's because I want to make sure we're all being heard. I don't want anyone to think their fight isn't important. It's just that sometimes it feels like the people who have the most resources are the ones who get the loudest voice. Whoopi smiled faintly. But that's where the conversation begins, right? The loudest voices have to use their platforms for good. But it's just as important for everyone to have a voice. And that's why we need to keep having these difficult conversations. even when they get uncomfortable. The show's crew, who had been standing by, made subtle adjustments in the background, preparing for the next segment. But it was clear that the energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't just about the debate over privilege or activism anymore. It was about understanding the complexities of social change and how difficult it can be to find common ground. As the hosts prepared to wrap up, Whoopi turned to the camera one final time. At the end of the day, we're all in this together. We're all trying to make the world a better place, in our own way. And while it may not always be easy, the most important thing is that we keep the conversation going. We may not agree on everything, but we can always learn from each other. She paused, her eyes glancing toward the empty seat where Michael J. Fox had once sat. To everyone watching, we want to thank you for joining us today. The issues we discussed are important, and they affect millions of lives. We may not have all the answers, but the conversation doesn't stop here. Let's continue to ask the hard questions and keep pushing for a better future. With that, the camera zoomed out, the show's familiar theme music playing softly in the background as the credits began to roll. But even as the lights dimmed and the show wrapped up, the audience knew that what they had just witnessed was anything but ordinary. They had seen a clash of ideas, a battle of perspectives, and a raw look at what happens when two people, both passionate about the same cause, come to loggerheads over how to fight for it. And as the audience turned off their TVs, they couldn't help but wonder, what happens when the fight for change is as personal as the issues we care about? As the tension slowly began to dissipate, Whoopi Goldberg took a deep breath, her mind still processing the heated exchange that had unfolded. The studio had gone quiet, the audience's mixed reactions lingering in the air. They had all witnessed something profound, an argument between two passionate individuals, each deeply committed to their cause but unable to find common ground. The show had started with the promise of a thoughtful discussion, but it had ended in a personal confrontation that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. Well, that was intense, Whoopi said finally, turning her attention back to the audience. This wasn't the conversation we planned for today. But maybe it's the conversation we needed. Sometimes, when emotions are high, we find out where the real challenges lie. The other hosts nodded in agreement, their faces reflective. No one seemed quite sure how to proceed, but they all knew that the events of the last hour had left a lasting impact. There was no going back to business as usual. The fight for social change, for better health care, for better access, had never felt so personal. Joy sat back in her chair, the earlier fire in her eyes now replaced with something more thoughtful. "I didn't expect things to get so heated," she said quietly. "But maybe that's the problem. We don't talk about these things enough. We don't talk about the real differences in people's experiences. We don't acknowledge how wide the gap really is between the haves and the have-nots." Whoopi, sensing the shift in tone, leaned forward slightly. "We need to talk about it, Joy. But we also need to remember that we're all on the same team. The goal is the same: better access, better care, better lives for everyone. The method may differ, but that doesn't mean we're not fighting for the same thing." Sarah, still processing everything, added, "I think what struck me most was how personal this all became. Michael's work is meaningful and it's clear that he cares. But Joy is right too. His experience is different. And when we're talking about something as personal as healthcare, the way we approach it matters. We have to be willing to listen to each other's experiences." Joy nodded, her expression softening. "I agree. I just hope that people understand that when I ask tough questions, it's because I want to make sure we're all being heard. I don't want anyone to think their fight isn't important. It's just that sometimes it feels like the people who have the most resources are the ones who get the loudest voice." Whoopi smiled faintly. "But that's where the conversation begins, right? The loudest voices have to use their platforms for good. But it's just as important for everyone to have a voice. And that's why we need to keep having these difficult conversations, even when they get uncomfortable." The show's crew, who had been standing by, made subtle adjustments in the background, preparing for the next segment. But it was clear that the energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't just about the debate over privilege or activism anymore. It was about understanding the complexities of social change and how difficult it can be to find common ground. As the hosts prepared to wrap up, Whoopi turned to the camera one final time. At the end of the day, we're all in this together. We're all trying to make the world a better place, in our own way. And while it may not always be easy, the most important thing is that we keep the conversation going. We may not agree on everything, but we can always learn from each other. She paused, her eyes glancing toward the empty seat where Michael J. Fox had once sat. To everyone watching, we want to thank you for joining us today. The issues we discussed are important, and they affect millions of lives. We may not have all the answers, but the conversation doesn't stop here. Let's continue to ask the hard questions and keep pushing for a better future. We want to hear from you, the viewers. After hearing both sides of this conversation, whose perspective do you resonate with? Do you think privilege plays a significant role in activism, or do you believe that anyone, regardless of their circumstances, can speak for change? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep having these important discussions. Keep the conversation alive and join us next time as we continue exploring the issues that matter to you. With that, the camera zoomed out, the show's familiar theme music playing softly in the background as the credits began to roll. But even as the lights dimmed and the show wrapped up, the audience knew that what they had just witnessed was anything but ordinary. They had seen a clash of ideas, a battle of perspectives, and a raw look at what happens when two people, both passionate about the same cause, come to loggerheads over how to fight for it. And as the audience turned off their TVs, they couldn't help but wonder, what happens when the fight for change is as personal as the issues we care about?